Picture this. You're wading through what feels like an endless graveyard of mud. Every step is a battle against suction. You haven't slept in 96 hours because there is no dry land. If you stop moving, you sink. If you fall, the swamp takes you whole. All around you, men are dying while still standing upright, too exhausted to lift their faces above the water. They don't even have the strength to scream. They just disappear. And at the front of this march from hell is a man riding the last surviving elephant. He's gripping the reins with trembling, feverish hands. His right eye is swollen shut, leaking infection, pulsing with a pain so violent it would drop a normal soldier instantly. But he doesn't stop. He doesn't cry out. He doesn't even slow down. He just keeps pushing forward. This is the brutal reality of 217 BC, and the man destroying his own body to destroy Rome is Hannibal Barca. Before we dive into this relentless story of survival and revenge, if you want more hidden truths from history, hit that like button, subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. Seriously, seeing how we're all connected by curiosity across the world is one of the coolest things about this channel. Now, the crossing of the Arno Marshes wasn't a march. It was a slow-motion catastrophe. Most history books barely mention it. They obsess over the Alps. And yeah, the Alps were brutal. But the Alps were just cold. The marshes were lethal. For 4 days and 3 nights, Hannibal's army never touched dry ground. No camps, no fires, no cooking, no rest, just walking, constantly. The front of the column churned the earth into thick, sucking sludge. By the time the soldiers in the back reached the same spot, it wasn't even ground anymore. It was liquid filth, and when exhaustion finally crushed them, the men didn't lie down to sleep. They couldn't. The mud would swallow them. So they climbed onto bloated carcasses of dead pack animals, using the bodies like rafts, just to keep their heads above the water for a few stolen minutes of sleep. That's what Hannibal demanded, and it almost killed them. Hannibal himself rode atop Surus, his war elephant, which kept him above the mud, but it didn't keep him safe. Swamp bacteria settled into his right eye. The infection exploded. The swelling became monstrous. The pain must have been unbearable. But Hannibal had no doctors, no clean bandages, no time, so he made a decision. He let the eye die. He sacrificed half his vision so the army could keep moving. And the question is, why? Why force your army through a route that kills them faster than the enemy? Because speed is the deadliest weapon in war. The Roman consul Flaminius was waiting on the main road, guarding the easy path, confident no army could survive the marshes. He was wrong. Hannibal didn't just flank the Romans. He appeared behind them like a ghost. When his army finally staggered onto dry land in Etruria, caked in mud, hollow-eyed, half-blind, they had achieved something Rome thought was impossible. They had bypassed every fortification, and that shock wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. Hannibal had proven something terrifying. He would endure any pain, cross any hell, sacrifice anything, just to get his hands around Rome's throat. But a man who can let his own eye rot out of his skull for strategy isn't created overnight. That level of discipline, that obsession, that hatred, it's made, manufactured, engineered. So to understand the monster who crawled out of that swamp, we have to go back 20 years, back to a temple in Carthage, where a father is about to place a knife into a 9-year-old boy's future and light a fuse that will burn the world. Because Hannibal wasn't born a monster, he was built, and his architect was his father. Hamilcar Barca. Even his name carried electricity. Barca means lightning, and like lightning, Hamilcar was brilliant, terrifying, and destructive. Now picture Carthage in 241 BC. The First Punic War has just ended. To the average Carthaginian citizen, it was simply a defeat. But to Hamilcar, it was betrayal. He had fought Rome in Sicily for years and never lost a battle. He was a tactical mastermind, running circles around clumsy Roman legions. But while he was winning in the field, the politicians back home surrendered. They signed a humiliating treaty. Carthage lost Sicily. They lost Sardinia. They were forced into crippling war reparations. Rome didn't just defeat them. They bullied them. They stripped them bare. So Hamilcar came home not as a beaten general, but as a man whose rage had gone ice cold. He realized something terrifying. Rome couldn't be reasoned with. Rome wasn't a rival. Rome was a predator. And unless someone destroyed it first, it would eventually eat Carthage alive. But Hamilcar also knew he wasn't going to live long enough to finish the job. So he did what all men obsessed with legacy do. He built a weapon that could outlive him. Enter Hannibal. The defining moment of Hannibal's entire life happened when he was only 9 years old. It's one of the most famous scenes in Roman Republic history. But most people miss the psychological weight of what happened. Hamilcar was preparing to leave for Spain, known then as Iberia, to rebuild Carthage's power and secure the silver mines needed to pay off Rome's extortion fees. And little Hannibal begged to go with him. He didn't want the soft luxury of Carthage. He wanted the life of soldiers. Hamilcar agreed, but only on one condition. He took his son into the temple of Baal Hammon. Imagine it. Heavy incense hanging in the air. Flickering firelight. Priests watching in silence. In the ancient world, an oath wasn't just words. It was a contract with the gods. Break it, and you invited cosmic punishment. Hamilcar made the boy place his small hand on the sacrificial victim, freshly killed, still warm, slick with blood, and swear a vow. The exact wording shifts depending on the ancient source, but the meaning was absolute. I swear that as soon as age permits, I will use fire and steel to stop the destiny of Rome. That wasn't a promise. That was a chain, a psychological anchor. From that moment on, Hannibal didn't have a normal childhood. He didn't grow up as a prince. He grew up as a weapon. Hamilcar took him to Spain, far from the corrupt Senate of Carthage, and for the next decade, Hannibal's classroom was the battlefield. And here's why this matters so much. While young Roman aristocrats were learning rhetoric, law, and debate in the forum, Hannibal was learning how to sleep on hard earth, how to survive hunger, how to endure cold, how to kill. He ate what the common soldiers ate. He wore what they wore. He fought beside them. Because Hamilcar was teaching him a lesson that Rome still hadn't fully learned. Loyalty isn't bought with gold. It's earned through shared suffering. That upbringing created something rare. Hannibal was a high-born noble with the instincts of a grunt. One moment, he could debate philosophy with Greek tutors. The next, he could take a man apart with a blade. He learned to read terrain like a map, and men like books. Most importantly, he watched his father fight. He absorbed Hamilcar's tactics, ambushes, speed, lightning warfare. But Hamilcar ran out of time. In 228 BC, during a skirmish with local tribes, he was cornered. To save his sons, he drew the enemy away and drowned in a river. Hannibal was 18 years old, and he watched his father die. The architect was gone. but the weapon was finished. When Hannibal took command at age 26, he wasn't just a general. He was his father's ghost made flesh, and he had the finest army in the world. A multicultural force of Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians, loyal not to Carthage, but to the Barca bloodline. And he had a plan. He wasn't going to wait for Rome to strike. He was going to bring the war to them. So Hannibal looked north, toward the mountains no army had ever crossed in force. The Alps were calling. In late 218 BC, Hannibal made a decision military experts called insanity. He stared at the frozen wall of the Alps, the natural fortress of Italy, and said, "We're going over it." And to understand how crazy this was, you have to remember something. To the ancient world, the Alps weren't just mountains. They were the edge of the known earth, a place where gods lived and humans died. And Hannibal was about to lead an army through it anyway. He wasn't just hiking with a backpack. He was moving a city. Hannibal had roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. And that last number alone should make your brain stop. Because an elephant eats around 300 pounds of food a day. Now imagine trying to feed dozens of them while climbing into barren, frozen peaks where there isn't even grass. Every scrap of food had to be carried. Every animal had to be controlled. Every man had to keep moving. This wasn't a march. It was a race against starvation, and the mountains weren't empty. Hostile Gallic tribes lived there, people who saw Hannibal's army for what it really was, a slow-moving buffet. As the Carthaginian column stretched for miles along narrow, icy ledges, the tribes attacked from above. They hurled rocks, they rolled boulders, they smashed men and horses, sending them screaming into ravines. The mountains echoed with falling bodies. It was a massacre in slow motion. Hannibal was forced into a kind of warfare most armies had never even imagined, a vertical war. He sent light infantry scrambling up cliffs just to seize high ground and stop the rain of death. But even those tribes weren't the true enemy. The true enemy was the cold. As the army climbed higher, the autumn snow began to fall. Paths vanished. The world turned white. Men who had spent their lives under African and Spanish sun were now freezing in their armor. Fingers went numb. Feet turned black. Horses slipped. Mules tumbled. And when an animal fell, it dragged men with it, over the edge. The psychological toll was crushing. Every step became a coin toss with death. And then, they hit the roadblock. A landslide. A massive collapse had torn away the path along a cliffside. One side, a sheer rock wall. The other, a 1,000-foot drop. The army couldn't go forward. They couldn't retreat. The tribes were behind them. Supplies were running out. They were trapped on a frozen ledge. This is where Hannibal's genius shifted from tactical to something else entirely. Engineering. He didn't panic. He didn't scream. He used science. He ordered his men to cut down the few twisted trees clinging to life nearby and pile the wood around the boulders blocking the path. Then they lit it, and they waited. The rocks began to glow red hot, and then Hannibal gave the next order. Pour their rations of sour wine, basically vinegar, over the blazing stone. The sudden cold shock cracked the rock. It shattered. The boulders crumbled. Men attacked it with pickaxes. They carved and cleared, shift after shift, desperate, starving, until the path was wide enough for elephants. And the descent into Italy? Ironically, it was even worse than the ascent. The southern slopes were steeper, slick with ice hidden beneath fresh snow. Men stepped onto what looked like solid ground, and slid uncontrollably to their deaths. Animals lost traction, bodies piled in the ravines below. But finally, after 15 days in hell, Hannibal's army staggered out of the Alps and into the Po Valley. The cost was catastrophic. He entered the mountains with nearly 60,000 men. He emerged with barely 26,000. Nearly half the army was gone. Many elephants were dead. He arrived gaunt, exhausted, and vastly outnumbered by the Roman legions waiting to crush him. But he had achieved the one thing Rome never expected. He was there. The Roman Senate panicked. They had believed the Alps were an impenetrable shield. Now the monster was in their backyard. And the crossing wasn't just movement. It was a statement. It told Rome no barrier, natural or man-made, could keep Hannibal Barca out. The invasion had begun. By the spring of 217 BC, Hannibal was deep inside Italy. He had survived the Alps. He had survived the marshes, but survival wasn't enough. He needed a victory so devastating that Rome would lose confidence in itself. And to do that, he didn't look for a battlefield. He looked for a victim. His target was Gaius Flaminius, a Roman consul who was brave, patriotic, and fatally arrogant. Hannibal understood Flaminius's psychology immediately. This man wasn't built to sit still. He wasn't built to wait. He was a politician, a man who needed a quick victory to impress voters back in Rome. So Hannibal decided to torture him, psychologically. He marched his army straight past Flaminius's camp. He burned villages. He destroyed crops. He slaughtered livestock. But he refused to fight. It was like Hannibal was walking right by and spitting in Flaminius's face, daring him to come out. And Flaminius took the bait. Enraged, humiliated, desperate to prove himself, he ordered his legions to pursue Hannibal, fast, no caution, no proper scouting. He was chasing a ghost, and that ghost was leading him straight into a slaughterhouse. The trap was Lake Trasimene. Geographically, it was perfect. A narrow road ran along the northern shore of the lake, squeezed between water on one side and steep forested hills on the other. Once you entered that road, there was nowhere to run. And on the morning of June 21st, a thick, heavy fog rolled in off the lake. It blanketed the valley floor. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and Hannibal had hidden his entire army in the hills above. Infantry, cavalry, slingers, all perfectly concealed by trees and fog. Below them, the Roman army marched forward in a long, disorganized column. They couldn't see the hills. They couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't even see the end of their own line. They believed Hannibal was days ahead, running, terrified. Then the signal was given, and the hills came alive. Thousands of Carthaginian warriors surged downhill, crashing into the Roman flank like an avalanche of steel. The fog was so thick that Romans didn't even realize they were under attack until spears were already inside their chests. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. The Romans were trapped. Turn left, Carthaginian shield wall. Turn right, the lake. And thousands of men, weighed down by armor, were shoved into deep water and mud. They drowned, screaming, clawing at each other, sinking like stones. The lake turned red, so red that even today, a nearby stream carries the name Sanguinatum, the place of blood. But here's the detail that sounds unreal. While this massacre was happening, a massive earthquake struck the region, powerful enough to topple statues in cities nearby, powerful enough to divert rivers, powerful enough to trigger landslides in the mountains. And yet, Roman historian Livy records that not a single soldier on the battlefield noticed it. Not one. They were so locked into survival, so consumed by killing and dying, that the earth shook beneath their feet, and nobody felt it. That is total war. In less than 3 hours, 15,000 Romans were dead. Another 10,000 were captured. Flaminius himself was cut down and decapitated by a Gallic horseman, his head mounted on a spear. The Roman army in the north had ceased to exist. When the news reached Rome, the Senate didn't even try to soften it. A magistrate stepped out into the forum, faced the weeping crowd, and said simply, "We have been defeated in a great battle." Panic exploded. Bridges over the Tiber were destroyed. Women prayed in the temples. People expected Hannibal to march through the gates at any moment. But Hannibal didn't. Not yet. Because Hannibal knew something Rome didn't understand. A victory isn't the end. It's just the opening move. And Trasimene wasn't his masterpiece. It was his warm-up. Because what was coming next wasn't tragedy. It was apocalypse. He was heading toward a dusty plain called Cannae. August 2nd, 216 BC, the Apulian plain near Cannae. The sun is brutal, blazing overhead, and a hot wind called the Vulturnus is blowing grit and dust directly into Roman faces, blinding them before the battle even begins. Rome is done playing chess. They want brute force. They want a sledgehammer. So they assemble the largest army they've ever fielded, 8 legions plus allies, nearly 86,000 men. A massive human wall designed to flatten Hannibal. Leading them is Consul Terentius Varro, a man who believes subtlety is cowardice. Hannibal, outnumbered almost 2-1, does something that looks like madness. He arranges his infantry in a convex crescent, a bulge outward toward the Roman line. And at the center of that bulge, he places his weakest troops, the Gauls, the Iberians. Meanwhile, on the far wings, hidden behind the curve, he places his elite African heavy infantry. It's a trap made of human flesh, and Rome walks into it willingly. When the massive Roman block slammed into the center of Hannibal's line, the impact was earth-shaking. Shields cracked, spears splintered. Men were shoved so tightly together they could barely breathe. The Gauls and Iberians in the center held for a moment, and then they began to retreat. But here's the key. They didn't break. They didn't run. They didn't panic. They stepped backwards slowly, fighting the entire time. And the Romans? The Romans thought this was victory. They surged forward, roaring, convinced Hannibal's line was collapsing. They pushed deeper and deeper and deeper, but they weren't breaking Hannibal's army. They were entering it. Because as the center retreated, the crescent inverted. That outward bulge became an inward pocket, a concave bowl, a tightening sack. The Roman army, the biggest force Rome had ever gathered, was now funneling itself into a kill box. And then Hannibal gave the order. The elite African infantry on the wings swung inward like closing doors. They smashed into the Roman flanks. At the same moment, Hannibal's cavalry, who had already obliterated Rome's horsemen, returned and slammed into the Roman rear. And suddenly, the Romans realized the truth. They weren't winning. They were surrounded. The trap was shut. The double envelopment was complete. But this is where the history books often stop, and the horror begins. Because what happened inside that tightening ring wasn't a normal battlefield slaughter. It was physics. It was compression. Imagine 80,000 men trapped in a space that keeps shrinking. As the Carthaginian ring tightened, the Romans were pressed together so tightly they couldn't lift their arms to swing a sword, shoulder to shoulder, chest to back. The air itself became scarce. The dust kicked up by thousands of struggling feet turned the world into a choking storm. The heat was suffocating. Panic spread. The men in the center couldn't even see the enemy. They could only hear the screams of those being hacked apart at the edges. They were being crushed by the weight of their own army. Some accounts describe men digging holes in the earth and burying their faces in the dirt, choosing to suffocate themselves rather than wait for the blade. Others were found with their hamstrings slashed. Because Hannibal's soldiers developed a system, they cut the legs of the outer Romans to drop them, then moved inward, killing the next man standing, then came back later to finish the crippled ones. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was industrial-scale butchery. For hours, the Carthaginians hacked away at the trapped mass, and at the height of it, it's estimated that 600 Roman soldiers were dying every minute. That is 10 men every second. By sunset, the field fell silent. Over 50,000 Romans lay dead. Among them were 80 senators and Consul Paulus. Rome had lost 20% of its entire adult male population in a single afternoon. The blood was so thick the victors had to scrape gore off their arms just to hold their loot. Hannibal had done the impossible. He annihilated a superior force through pure tactical geometry. The Battle of Cannae is still taught in military academies today as one of the most perfect victories in recorded history. But for the men trapped in that circle, it was the day the world ended. The sun dropped over Cannae, and the silence afterward was heavier than the noise of battle. In Hannibal's camp, celebration erupted, wild, drunken, unbelieving. They had erased Rome's army. The road to Rome seemed open. And that night, inside Hannibal's command tent, his cavalry commander Hannibal slammed his fist on the table. Adrenaline still burning in his veins, he looked Hannibal dead in the eye and made a bold proposal. "Send me ahead with the cavalry, and in 5 days, you will dine in the capital of Rome." It was the obvious move. Rome was reeling, its legions were gone. The gates, in theory, were exposed. But Hannibal sat there, staring at the map, and shook his head. He refused. He wanted time. Time to rest his men, time to gather supplies, time to build siege equipment. Hannibal stared at him like he'd lost his mind. And then he uttered one of the most famous lines in military history. "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Was Hannibal's hesitation a mistake? Historians have argued about that for 2,000 years. If Hannibal had marched immediately, could he have destroyed Rome right then? Maybe. But Hannibal wasn't a gambler. He was a professional soldier. He knew Rome was a city of thick walls and hundreds of thousands of citizens who would fight street by street. And he didn't have catapults. He didn't have rams. He didn't have the tools for a siege. So Hannibal made a calculated bet. He assumed Rome would act like a rational nation. Because in the ancient world, losing your army meant one thing. You sued for peace. That was the rule. So instead of marching, Hannibal sent his brother Mago back to Carthage. And Mago didn't deliver the news with a speech. He delivered it with a sound. He walked into the Carthaginian Senate and overturned a massive basket onto the marble floor. Thousands of gold rings spilled out, clattering like rain. And in Rome, only the upper classes, the equestrians, senators, nobility, were allowed to wear gold rings. Mago explained. Each ring came from a dead Roman noble. The pile was so huge it had to be measured by the peck. It wasn't just proof of victory. It was proof that Rome's leadership had been decapitated. Carthage celebrated, but Rome transformed. When the first survivors from Cannae stumbled back into the city, panic threatened to rip Rome apart. The cry echoed in the streets. "Hannibal ad portas! Hannibal is at the gates!" But then something terrifying happened. The Roman Senate met, not to surrender, not to negotiate, but to outlaw grief. They passed decrees forbidding women to cry in public. They limited mourning to 30 days. They banned the word peace. This wasn't just discipline. This was trauma turning into madness. They were so shattered, they rejected reality. And to appease the gods, the civilized Romans turned to barbarism. In the Forum Boarium, they buried 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks alive. Human sacrifice, hoping the blood would wash away bad omens. It showed the depth of their terror. They would do anything to survive. Then came the mobilization. Rome scraped the bottom of the barrel. They lowered the recruitment age, taking boys who hadn't even reached puberty. They emptied prisons and armed criminals. And most shockingly, they bought 8,000 slaves, armed them, and promised freedom if they fought. They called them velones. Hannibal sent an envoy to Rome offering a ransom for thousands of prisoners taken at Cannae. Standard practice. You pay. I return your men. The Roman Senate refused to even meet the envoy. They declared any Roman who surrendered was unworthy of saving. They left their own sons and brothers to rot in Hannibal's camps rather than give him a single coin. And that's when Hannibal realized something cold. He had broken Rome's army, but he hadn't broken its mind. In fact, he'd done the opposite. He had stripped away their humanity and turned Rome into a cornered, rabid animal, one that would fight until the last breath. The war of tactics was over. The war of attrition had begun. For the next 13 years, a strange stalemate settled over Italy. Hannibal was technically winning. He marched up and down the boot of Italy, undefeated, raiding cities, capturing towns. But he was fighting a ghost, because Rome finally learned its lesson. After Cannae, they stopped meeting him in open battle. They handed command to one man who understood Hannibal better than anyone else. Quintus Fabius Maximus. His nickname was Cunctator, the Delayer. The Romans hated him. They called him a coward. They mocked him. But Fabius understood something crucial. Hannibal's weakness wasn't tactics. It was supply. So Fabius introduced what we now call the Fabian strategy. A war of shadows. Wherever Hannibal went, Fabius followed, but always just out of reach. If Hannibal entered the valley to forage, Fabius watched from the ridge. If Hannibal tried to bait him into battle, Fabius refused, and even worse. Fabius ordered scorched earth. He burned Roman crops, destroyed Roman farms, evacuated villages before Hannibal arrived. He starved his own people to starve Hannibal first. It was cruel, unpopular, and brilliant. Hannibal was now a prisoner of Italy, like a lion inside a cage. He could roar, he could pace, but he couldn't get out, and his army began to change. The hardened veterans who had crossed the Alps were aging, dying of sickness and years. They were replaced by local Italian mercenaries, men who didn't share the same loyalty, hunger, or discipline. The Carthaginian blade was dulling. Still, Hannibal's brilliance hadn't vanished. There's a famous story from the Ager Falernus region that proves he remained a master of deception. Fabius finally trapped Hannibal in a valley, blocking every mountain pass. It looked like checkmate. But that night, Roman sentries on the ridges saw something horrifying. Thousands of torches moving up the mountainside in the dark. It looked like Hannibal was launching a desperate night escape over the peaks. Fabius shifted his troops to intercept, and it was a trick. Hannibal had gathered 2,000 oxen, tied bundles of wood to their horns, lit them on fire, and stampeded them up the mountain. While the Romans chased burning cows, Hannibal quietly marched his real army through the unguarded pass below. He escaped, again, but these flashes of genius were becoming rare. The reality was grim. Hannibal was getting almost no help from Carthage. The politicians back home were jealous, suspicious, and unwilling to send reinforcements. So Hannibal fought alone, and while he was trapped playing cat and mouse in Italy, Rome made moves elsewhere. They couldn't kill the lion, so they decided to attack the lion's den. They sent armies into Spain, into Africa, and rising through Rome's ranks was a young survivor of Cannae, a man who studied Hannibal not with fear, but with obsession. He didn't want to avoid Hannibal. He wanted to become him. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he was about to change everything. While Hannibal was stuck in Italy, the real war began turning in Spain. Scipio was only 25 years old, too young by law to command an army. But he was the only Roman willing to take the job. Why? Because Hannibal's armies had killed his father and uncle. Scipio wasn't just fighting for Rome, he was fighting for revenge. And Scipio was different. He didn't fight like a Roman, he fought like Hannibal. He understood war wasn't about rules, it was about breaking them. In 209 BC, Scipio targeted New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital in Spain. It was a fortress surrounded by water on 3 sides, considered impregnable. But Scipio did his homework. He learned from fishermen that the lagoon on the northern side drained drastically at low tide. Just like Hannibal used the Alps and the marshes, Scipio used the sea. He waited for the tide to drop, then marched his soldiers through shallow water where the walls were low and unguarded. They stormed the city. In one afternoon, Scipio captured Carthage's treasury, its hostages, and its best artisans. He didn't just win a battle, he stole Hannibal's wallet, and with Spain slipping away, Hannibal's position in Italy became desperate. He was running out of men. His last hope was his brother, Hannibal Barca.